back for another deep dive. We've got some really fascinating source material today, stuff that's probably going to mess with how you think about something you deal with pretty much every day, price.
Yeah, we are digging into excerpts from Dan Ariely's book, Predictably Irrational, specifically at Chapter 2. It's called The Fallacy of Supply and Demand, Why the Price of Pearls and Everything Else is Up in the Air.
Up in the air.
Yeah.
I mean, just that title, right? It flips the whole script on prices being these, like, fixed logical things.
Totally.
So our mission today is to unpack these, well, surprising ideas. We'll see why the price of luxury black pearls might actually connect to, say, how much you'd pay for a keyboard.
Or even how much you'd want someone to pay you to listen to an annoying sound.
Exactly. It's all about how these seemingly random first values can kind of stick with us.
Yeah, and create this ripple effect on, well, pretty much all our future decisions about value.
It really challenges that standard economic model, doesn't it? The one where it's supply and demand to sort of meet in the middle independently.
It absolutely does. Ariely argues it's way more complex, and often those first values we latch onto not nearly as rational as we think.
Okay, let's dive in. The chapter kicks off with this amazing story about Salvador Asale, the Pearl King.
Oh yeah, the Tahitian black pearls. It's a classic story.
So tell us about it. He found these pearls.
Right, back in 1973, he came across these black pearls from French Polynesia. But the thing was, there was basically zero market for them. Nothing.
No demand. People just didn't want black pearls.
Nope. No established value. The source even calls them something of dubious worth. Not exactly a hot commodity.
Right. So what did he do? He didn't just sell them cheap.
No, that's the fascinating part. He tried showing them around, didn't work. They were kind of big, maybe a bit drab compared to traditional white pearls. He could have just dumped them. Instead, he holds on to them, waits a year, gets better specimens, apparently, and then he does something really bold.
Which was?
He takes them to Harry Winston, you know, the Harry Winston Fifth Avenue jeweler, and he convinces Winston not just to display them, but to display them with an outrageously high price tag.
Wow. So he didn't find the market price, he just declared it high.
Pretty much. And then he doubled down.
Yeah.
Full-page ads, glossy magazines, putting the black pearls right next to diamonds, rubies, emeralds.
Ah, so creating that association. If they're next to diamonds, they must be valuable.
Exactly. He's framing them as peak luxury right from the get-go, setting that initial very high anchor price.
Yeah, it worked.
It totally worked. He transformed these like unwanted things into something fabulously fine, super coveted. You know, it's like that Mark Twain quote in the source, make something desirable by making it hard to get. Asale made them desirable by making them seem incredibly expensive and exclusive.
Okay, but how? How did people just accept that? Why did they suddenly want them at that price?
Well, this is where the book takes a bit of a turn. It talks about goslings.
Goslings. Baby geese. What do they have to do with pearls?
Okay, yeah, sounds weird, I know. But it's about the work of Konrad Lorenz, the Nobel laureate. He found that goslings, when they hatch, they imprint on the first moving thing they see.
Usually the mother goose, right?
Usually. But Lorenz showed it could be him or even like an object. They just form this irreversible bond and follow it.
Okay. So are you saying our brains are like gosling brains when it comes to prices?
That's the connection Ariely makes. He calls it anchoring. The idea is when we see a new product, that first price we encounter, or the first price we seriously consider paying, it acts like that first moving object for the gosling. It imprints on us.
It sets an anchor.
Exactly. It sets an initial value. And then if we actually buy something at a certain price, that action reinforces the anchor for us. It makes it stronger.
Okay, but how strong is this anchor?
Yeah.
Especially if the first price is just made up, like a sales pearl price or something else.
Right, which leads perfectly into this really cool experiment they did at MIT. Ariely and his colleagues, Jerzen Prelec and George Lowenstein.
The one with the social security numbers.
That's the one. They got MBA students, right? And first, they had them write down the last 2 digits of their social security number.
Which is just a random number for each person. Totally arbitrary.
Completely arbitrary. Has nothing to do with value. Then they showed them a list of items. Wine, a cordless keyboard, trackball, design books, some fancy chocolates.
Yep.
And they asked, would you, hypothetically, pay an amount in dollars equal to your 2-digit number for this item? So if you ended in, say, 75, would you pay $75 for the wine?
Gotcha. So just thinking about that price, that number next to the item, that sets the anchor.
That seems to be the key, just contemplating the price. After that, they held a real auction, well, a second price auction, but still real bidding for those same items.
And they were testing for arbitrary coherence, right? The idea that the arbitrary number, the anchor, shapes the bids.
But the bids still make sense relative to each other. Coherent.
So what happened?
The results were pretty stunning. Students with high social security number endings say 80 to 99, they bid way more for every single item than the students with low numbers, like 1 to 20.
So much more.
For the cordless keyboard, for example, the high number group bid an average of $56. The low number group, just $16.
Whoa. $56 versus $16.
Yeah.
Just based on writing down a random number beforehand.
Yep. That's the arbitrary part, the anchor pulling prices way up or down. But here's the coherence part.
Okay.
No matter if their anchor was high or low, people still bid consistently based on relative value. They bid more for the fancy Hermitage wine than the basic Cote du Rhone, more for the keyboard than the trackball.
Ah, okay. So the starting point was random, set by the number. But after that, their sense of relative value kicked in. Keyboard is worth more than a trackball, generally.
Exactly. Their internal valuation scale was shifted up or down by the arbitrary anchor, but the relationships between items on that scale stayed logical or coherent. They weren't just bidding randomly across the board.
So in real life, the anchor isn't our social security number. It's, what, the first price tag we see.
Could be. Or the manufacturer's suggested retail price, the MSRP. Or an advertised price. Anything that makes you consider a specific price for something new, that's enough to potentially set the anchor.
And these anchors, they don't just vanish after that first decision, do they? They stick around.
Oh, they absolutely stick. That first anchor can influence you for a long time. Like the example of buying a TV. If you seriously consider, or maybe even buy, a fancy LCD TV for $3,000,
Okay.
that $3,000 becomes your mental benchmark, your anchor for TVs. Every other TV price you see later gets compared back to that initial $3,000 anchor you set.
Right. It's like that study mentioned about people moving house.
Yeah, Simonson and Lowenstein. They found people moving to a new city often stay anchored to the housing prices of their old city.
Really? How does that work?
Well, someone moving from, say, expensive Los Angeles to a cheaper city like Pittsburgh might end up spending more on a house than locals would. They're still thinking in LA terms, anchored high. And someone moving from a cheaper place, like Lubbock, Texas, to Pittsburgh, might buy a smaller house than locals because their anchor from Lubbock is still holding them back.
That's wild. You're dragging your old price reality with you, even when the market is totally different.
You are. The source actually suggests that maybe renting for a year in the new city could help. It gives you time to, break the old anchor and reset based on the new market reality.
Okay, that makes sense. So if these anchors are so sticky, can you even change them? Or does the first one just dominate everything? What about that annoying sounds experiment?
Yeah, that was a clever one. They needed something with absolutely no existing market price, no inherent value. So, annoying sounds.
Annoying sounds.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm listening. This sounds kind of fun.
So phase 1, participants hear a really unpleasant sound, like a high-pitched squeal. Then one group is asked, hypothetically, would you listen to this scan later for 10 cents? Another group, would you listen again for 90 cents?
Setting those initial anchors. 10 cents versus 90 cents. Arbitrary again.
Totally arbitrary. Then they asked people how much they would actually demand to be paid to listen to the sound again.
And what happened? Did the 10 cents versus 90 cents make a difference?
A huge difference. The group anchored at 10 cents only demanded on average 33 cents to listen again. But the group anchored at 90 cents. They demanded an average of 73 cents.
Wow, for the exact same unpleasant sound.
Yeah.
Just suggesting a higher initial number more than doubled what people felt they needed to be paid.
Yep. It set their perception of the cost of that unpleasantness, but then they went further.
Oh.
Phases 2 and 3. They introduced new annoying sounds, white noise, an oscillating sound, and sometimes they introduced new hypothetical anchors like 50 cents, or they even flipped the 10 and 90 cent offers for the new sounds.
Trying to see if a new anchor could override the first one.
Exactly. And the key finding was, well, the new anchors had some effect, sure, but the very first anchor they encountered for any annoying sound, that initial 10 cents or 90 cents for the squeal, that had the biggest, most lasting impact on what they demanded for all the sounds that followed.
So the first anchor in the category really ruled.
It predominated, as the source puts it. That first impression, that first decision or price consideration, it just echoes through a whole sequence of later decisions in that same category.
Which connects to this idea of habits, right?
Mm-hmm.
How these first decisions turn into repeated behaviors. You mentioned herding and self-hurting.
Right. Herding is, following the crowd. You see a line outside a restaurant, you figure it must be good, everyone else thinks so.
Okay.
Self-herding is when you follow yourself. You follow your own past actions.
Ah, okay. Like the Starbucks example in the book.
Exactly. That illustrates it perfectly.
Hmm.
Maybe the first time you go into a Starbucks, you're just desperate for coffee or curious. You see the prices, maybe get a bit of sticker shock compared to, say, Dunkin'.
Mm-hmm. Happens.
But you buy one anyway, and, the experience is fine. Decent coffee, nice atmosphere, whatever. That's the first decision. It sets an anchor for Starbucks.
Okay, got it.
So, the next week, you walk past Starbucks again. Do you do a full mental spreadsheet comparing price, taste, ambiance, convenience of every coffee place nearby?
Probably not.
Probably not. More likely you think something simpler like, I went there last week, it was okay, I enjoyed it, it must be a good decision for me. You're basically reminding yourself of your past behavior and assuming it was a good choice.
You're hurting yourself, following your own previous path.
Exactly. And doing that repeatedly builds the habit. The anchor gets stronger. And once you're anchored to Starbucks prices, maybe getting the venti instead of the grande, or trying that new expensive seasonal drink, it feels coherent. It doesn't seem like that much more compared to the anchor price you've already accepted by being a Starbucks customer.
You're judging it relative to your own Starbucks anchor, not relative to the price of coffee somewhere else.
Precisely.
But how did Starbucks even get people to accept those higher prices in the first place? Didn't people already have an anchor from cheaper places?
Well, that was the genius of Howard Schultz, much like a sale with the pearls. He didn't just try to sell slightly better coffee at a higher price. He created a whole different experience.
Right. The comfy chairs, the music, the fancy Italian-sounding names for sizes.
All of it. The smell, the look of the place. It was designed to feel completely distinct from a regular coffee shop or diner.
So it didn't feel like a direct comparison anymore.
Exactly. By changing the context so much, by making it feel like a new category of experience, the old, cheaper coffee anchor felt less relevant. It allowed people to accept a new, higher anchor for this Starbucks experience.
That's really smart. Create a new playing field where you can set the starting price high.
Yeah, allows that arbitrary coherence to take root in a space they basically invented.
And this applies even to things that are totally subjective, right? Like that poetry reading experiment. It reminds me of Tom Sawyer convincing his friends that painting a fence was fun.
Right. Framing something tedious as a privilege people would pay for. Airey did something similar with poetry. He read Walt Whitman to students, something with no clear market value, right? People might love it, hate it, be indifferent.
Very subjective. So how did he anchor them?
He created two groups. For half the students, the initial question was something like, would you pay $10 to attend a 10-minute reading?
Okay. Anchoring them to the idea of paying.
Yep. For the other half, the question was flipped. Would you attend if I paid you $10?
Anchoring them to the idea of being paid, like it's a chore.
Exactly, just setting that initial frame. Then he asked them all to state how much they would pay or would demand to be paid for poetry readings of different lengths.
And sexily, let me guess. Arbitrary coherence strikes again.
Perfectly. The students who were first asked if they'd pay, they actually offered to pay money to attend, usually a few bucks, and they offered more for longer readings.
Okay.
The students who were first asked if they'd attend, if paid, they demanded payment again, a few bucks on average, and they demanded more money for longer readings.
Wow. So just that initial suggestion, pay versus be paid, completely flipped whether they saw the experience as valuable or costly.
Totally. And once that frame was set by the anchor, their subsequent decisions about different lengths were totally coherent within that frame. It really shows how malleable our sense of value is.
So bringing this all back, what does this mean for us just living our lives?
Yeah.
The source really pushes you to think how many big choices we make, careers, maybe even who we marry, certainly our habits, what we like. How much of that is based on some initial, maybe random first impression or decision, those first imprints?
It's a kind of a confronting idea, isn't it? Are we really making choices based on what's best, or are we just following these paths that got set early on, maybe arbitrarily? Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. Maybe we need to examine our anchors.
So practically speaking, what can you do about this?
Well, first step is just awareness, right? Knowing we're vulnerable to this anchoring effect. Then maybe start questioning your own patterns, those repeated behaviors, that daily coffee, the phone upgrade, the place you always get lunch. Ask yourself, how did this start? Is the pleasure I get really worth the cost? Could I use that money or time better somewhere else?
And pay extra attention to the first time you make a decision in a new area, like buying your first car or subscribing to a new service.
Exactly. Because that first decision is potentially setting the anchor, the benchmark, that could influence you for years down the line. It's not just one choice, it's potentially setting a whole trajectory.
So maybe take an inventory of your own imprints and anchors. See if they still make sense.
That's a great way to put it. Reconsider those old choices.
Okay, so shifting slightly.
Yeah.
How does all this anchoring stuff mess with standard economic theory? You mentioned that at the start.
Right. It fundamentally challenges that clean picture of supply and demand being independent forces. Economics 101 says consumer demand and producer supply meet, and that sets the price. But these experiments show our willingness to pay isn't some fixed thing based purely on utility. It's really suggestible. It can be manipulated by these anchors.
And the anchors often come from the supply side, right? Like MSRPs, ads.
Exactly. So the suppliers aren't just responding to demand. They can actively shape demand by setting initial anchors. Supply and demand are tangled up. They're dependent, not independent. Anchors often come from supply, influencing demand.
So the book suggests maybe when we react strongly to a price change, it's not always about the actual value or pleasure, but more about our memory of the old price, our anchor.
Yeah, think about those hypothetical examples. Like if you suddenly forgot what milk costs, would a small price rise really bother you if the new price seemed okay in itself? Our outrage is often about the change relative to the anchor, not the absolute level.
Like a new gas tax. Initially, everyone hates it because you compare it to the old, lower price anchor.
Right. But over time, if the price stays high, maybe a new anchor forms, people adjust, the memory of the old price fades, and maybe consumption patterns eventually drift back because the new price becomes the baseline.
So this raises a pretty big question then, doesn't it, about free markets? If our choices are so easily swayed by these arbitrary anchors and not always based on maximizing our actual happiness or utility,
Does the completely free market automatically lead to the best outcomes for everyone? Maybe not always. We might get anchored to something expensive that doesn't actually bring us much joy, while ignoring something cheaper that we'd enjoy more, just because of how the anchors were set.
so if the market isn't always rational in delivering what's truly valuable or maximizing well-being, what's the takeaway?
Well, the implication, especially for essential things, healthcare, education, utilities, is that maybe relying purely on market forces driven by easily manipulated demand isn't the best idea. There might be a stronger case for government intervention or regulation in those areas to ensure fair access and pricing, rather than letting arbitrary anchors potentially drive outcomes.
Because the free market assumes a level of consumer rationality that, well, these experiments suggest we just don't always have.
Exactly. Our predictable irrationality, especially around anchoring and value, is a real force that needs to be considered, both in policy and just in our own lives.
Wow. Okay, what a deep dive this has been. From black pearls seemingly conjured into value, to Social Security numbers dictating bids, to realizing maybe why I always go to the same coffee shop.
Self-hurting.
Totally. It's clear that how we think about price and value is way more flexible and way more influenced by these first anchors than we probably realize.
Yeah, behavioral economics is great at sort of pulling back the curtain on these hidden forces that shape so much of what we do.
So here's something for you, the listener, to think about. Pick a significant preference you have, or a habit. Maybe it's a brand you always buy, a place you love going, how much you spend on something. Ask yourself, how much of that is based on some deep, carefully considered value, and how much might just be the echo of some early, maybe even random anchor you set for yourself way back when?
It's definitely food for thought. Makes you reconsider things.
We have only just scratched the surface of Predictably Irrational, believe me. Next time, we're going to tackle another really fascinating piece of human irrationality from the book.
Looking forward to it. Stay tuned.
Join us again for another deep dive.